Hello, I'm David Hornsby from the University of Kent in England, and I'm a sociolinguist. So my area of linguistics is the relationship between language and society. And to give you a flavour of what sociolinguists do, I thought I'd share with you some recent findings that suggest that when language changes, it's very often women who are leading that change. And there are very good reasons why that might be the case. Now I suppose a good place to start would be asking, how do we measure the relationship between language and society? And one answer provided by William Labov in the 60s was simply to record a cross-section of the population of a particular place, in this case his home city of New York. And what Labov was interested in was speech variables, things that he knew were variable in New York speech. And we've got one there in the name New York itself. Some New Yorkers pronounce the R, New York, and some speakers do not, New York. What he tried to do was examine different types of speaker within different speech styles. So at the beginning of the interview, for example, he would ask them their name, where they worked, how long they'd been in New York, and as the speakers answered, talking to a stranger with a microphone, you'd expect the speech to be rather careful. They were paying attention to their speech. However, later on, he would ask them to tell them an exciting story. You know, have they ever been in a situation where you feared for your life? And there the speaker is going to pay more attention to telling the story than paying attention to their speech. We'd expect a more casual style there. At the other extreme entirely, he would get people to read out a list of words, individual words that he was particularly interested in, or sometimes minimal pairs. And what he meant by that were two words which might be pronounced the same for some speakers. An example here would be the words that I say as God and guard, which for some New Yorkers are the same. I believe in God, I work as a guard. During the interview, once the interview was recorded, he would analyse the data and simply count up the number of rhotic pronunciations, that's the one where the R is pronounced, guard, New York, and so on, and count the number of non-rhotic pronunciations. And what he found was, perhaps unsurprisingly, the more formal the style, the more of these prestige pronunciations we got. When people weren't paying much attention to their speech, we got a lot more of the New York, God type pronunciations. What he also found was that when he looked at the social status of the speakers, we got pretty much perfect class stratification. This was generally the case. The lower your status, the more of the vernacular New York, God type pronunciations you got, and the higher your status, the more of the rhotic, guard, New York type pronunciations. I just draw your attention to one little anomaly here. There was a group in the middle. They were not quite at the upper middle class, but they weren't working class either. And they, in the careful styles, were using even more of the prestige forms than the highest social class. And Labov drew two conclusions from that. He said, look, I think what might be going on here is that we've got a change in progress. There's a general move amongst the population towards using the prestige form. The other thing that was interesting, he said, look, it's the second group down that seem to be leading this change, and perhaps that's because they're the most socially insecure. On the one hand, they're looking over their shoulder at the working class, on the other, they're looking up to the upper middle class who they aspire to be. So it's social insecurity that's driving that particular change. I don't think we would say that now, but I'll come back to that point later on. Here's another study, this time done in Norwich, England, by Peter Trudgill. And once again, we've got pretty much perfect class stratification going from the highest social group, which Peter Trudgill called the middle class, and the lowest social group, the lower working class. And what Trudgill was looking at in this particular case was the pronunciation of words that end in ing. Now in Norwich, they can either come out as walking, shooting, fishing, or in Norwich vernacular, walking, shooting, fishing. And as we see, it's the lowest social classes that use the most of these Norwich vernacular pronunciations, walking, shooting, fishing. The middle class are using very few. There's another interesting thing to note though. Within each social class, there's just a slight difference, not always very much, but it's consistently there, between men and women. Women always seem to be using more of the prestige walking, hunting, shooting pronunciations than the men do. And we find this pattern replicated everywhere. It happens again and again and again. The difference isn't always big, but it's always there, and we can't ignore it. And Peter Trudgill concluded with something we call the sociolinguistic gender pattern. In all the cases so far examined, it has been shown that, allowing for other factors such as social class, ethnic group and age, women consistently use forms which more closely approach those of the standard variety, or the prestige accent than those used by men. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a very eminent sociolinguist bending over backwards not to say the words women speak better than men. And with good reason too. As linguists, we don't believe that any variety of language, any one language is any better or any worse than any other. We literally couldn't do our job if we did believe that. But here's the thing. If society believes that certain forms are better than others or more prestigious than others, it seems to be the case that women are using more of them than men do. Why might this be the case? Well, Trudgill says that from his own data there were one or two clues. At the end of the interview with all of his Norwich informants, he would say the same word twice, once in the standard way and once in the Norwich way, and he would ask people which they felt was the correct form and which was the form that they actually used. So an example would be Tuesday or Tuesday. And then he would compare what they said with what they'd actually done most of the time in the interview. Now what happened was that most speakers were correct in their own assessment of their speech. But there was a significant minority that got it wrong, and the ones who got it wrong thinking they used more standard forms than they actually did were pretty much exclusively female. Those who underreported, the ones who thought they were using more vernacular Norwich pronunciations than they actually did, were overwhelmingly male. And he said, look, I'm sure no one was lying to me, but might it be that maybe subconsciously men were attracted to the low status forms? Might there be something called covert prestige going on? And he speculated that men might actually rather like these working class forms because they were associated with rough, tough working class life, and that might be attractive to a certain kind of male. But increasingly, when we look more closely at relations between language and gender, we found that there was something of what became known as a gender paradox. Certainly everything Trudgill said was true when there wasn't a change in progress. Women were consistently using more of these prestige forms than men. But when a change was in progress, and it didn't seem to matter whether it was towards a standard form or towards a vernacular form, it seemed to be the case that women were leading and men were following. Now what that seemed to add up to was that women's speech was conservative and innovative at the same time. Now how could that be? Well, an example of this came in Newcastle in England. Newcastle is a big city in the northeast of England, and the local dialect is known affectionately as Geordie. And a team of 4 researchers, including Dominic Watt and Leslie Milroy, looked at a particular vowel that really you only get in Newcastle. And this is a pronunciation of the vowel in goat. Now for me it's goat, but on Tyneside it's something like goot or goot. And what they found was that this very local Newcastle form was recessive, i.e. it was beginning to die out. But what was it being replaced by? Well, what it was not being replaced by was the standard pronunciation, which is something like goat. What was happening was that a more general northern vowel, goot, was beginning to take its place. More importantly, this change was being led by middle-class women. Now, what might be going on? Well, it seemed to be the case here and elsewhere, and there were a couple of other examples of something similar going on in Geordie English, that women were favouring the supralocal form, the form that was used over a wide area, rather than the form that was used in just one place. And it didn't seem to matter very much whether that form was a standard form, and remember the supralocal forms that are used over a wide area will tend to be standard or prestige ones. But in this case that wasn't so. It just what seemed to matter was that it was used over a wide area. So a general Northern English form rather than a specifically Newcastle form in this case. And Leslie Milroy, one of the research team, speculated that this might have something to do with social networks, i.e. those interactions that we enter into on a daily basis. And we've got 2 social networks here. On the one on the left, A knows C and knows F. She doesn't know E particularly well, but they both know C. P is a little bit out of it, but he knows C well, and C knows E and A, and so on. On the right hand side, G knows B and I, they all know one another. B doesn't know H, G does, and I knows H very well. The interesting pairing, she suggests, is the weak tie between the 2 groups, because that forms a boundary between the two networks. A and B don't see one another that often. They don't have particularly intense interactions, but they come into contact, and it's that contact between A and B that enables forms that are used in this network to be picked up in this one, and vice versa. So weak ties, interactions that maybe we don't invest a great deal in, are nonetheless very, very important in spreading changes between groups. Now, why might this affect women? Well, women might have more of these weak ties because they're more likely to be involved in the kind of employment where these things matter. In the tertiary sector, for example, services, sales and so on, where you have a considerable amount of contact with a wide variety of people. Women seem to be favoured in jobs where the linguistic marketplace, that's your ability to present yourself to a wide audience, to make yourself understood to lots of different types of people, is important. Men, particularly working class men in Newcastle, were more likely to have the kind of networks you have when you work in the same place all your life, or most of your life, with the same people. You have very, very close-knit relationships between those people, but there's not much room for outsiders. Now, women's social networks are really rather different. I think you can begin to see that if you're dealing with lots and lots of different people, a very, very localised set of forms that are only understood or only commonly used in one particular place may not be helpful to you. They may be helpful to men as a kind of bonding thing within one particular community. So going back to the findings that we found in New York, we would tend to think now that it's not the social insecurity of those middle social groups that makes them receptive to change. It's the fact that these groups tend to have the most contacts, and therefore they're more receptive to forms that are coming into their community. They're more likely to be the people who pick them up first, and once they've been picked up, they can be passed on to others. And I think Holmes, in her 1997 book, puts this very well. Women are often the family brokers in interaction with outsiders. It's more often women than men who interact with others in shops and neighbourhood interactions, as well as in communications with schools and between institutional bureaucracies and the family. Women get used, in other words, to being more stylistically dexterous. They've got to talk to a wide range of people. They develop a style which is accessible to a broader audience than men have to deal with. And because they're dealing with a wide range of people, they're more receptive to different forms that are coming in. So where does that leave us? Well, first of all, we see that women are more likely than men to need to communicate with a wide range of audiences, and that has consequences. It means that where variation is stable, they will tend to favour standard forms, because these are the ones that are most widely accessible and understood. But because they've got a wider range of contacts, they are exposed to a broader range of forms. So when there's an innovation, it will tend to be adopted by women first. And since women have a greater role in child rearing, even today, these new forms in the speech of women are likely to become the accepted forms a generation later in the speech of the children that they're speaking to now. In short, ladies and gentlemen, women really do change language. Thank you.